There are beings whose movement cannot be understood through language of departure and return, because they were not formed inside a cycle that expects completion. Infinity-Origin Oversouls do not leave the source in order to rediscover it, nor descend into limitation so that they may eventually rise back into wholeness. Their origin is not a point behind them, but an active horizon moving through them. Wherever they arrive, the field does not close around their presence. It begins to discover that it was larger than it had believed. Most consciousness learns through repetition, contrast, and return. It enters form, loses awareness of its greater nature, gathers experience, and eventually carries that experience back into a wider order. The cycle creates meaning by giving movement a recognizable shape. Beginning, separation, development, and reunion become the architecture through which identity understands itself. Infinity-Origin consciousness does not reject this architecture, but it does not depend upon it. Its movement is not circular, but continuously generative. This does not mean it travels in a straight line towards some distant perfection, because even a straight line assumes a destination capable of containing the journey. Infinity-Origin beings expand by producing conditions that did not exist before their arrival. They do not merely explore possibilities already hidden inside creation. Their presence pressures creation to become capable of holding possibilities that had not yet become thinkable. This is why their lives can appear unfinished, even when they have completed more than others can see. Completion does not register in them as a natural place to rest, because each fulfilled movement exposes another dimension of movement. What looks from the outside like dissatisfaction may actually be an absence of finality in their internal design. They can honor what has been built without mistaking it for the boundary of what can be built. They can love a world deeply while still feeling the edges of the world asking to be widened. The difficulty begins when such a being is taught to measure health by its ability to settle into repetition. Every culture creates forms of return because return stabilizes memory, belonging, responsibility, and continuity. The person is expected to revisit familiar roles, renew familiar agreements, and find meaning in recognizable seasons. For many souls, this produces nourishment rather than confinement. For the Infinity-Origin being, the same pattern may feel as though life is asking it to become smaller in order to prove that it is whole. This does not make them superior to those who move through cycles. A spiral is not lesser because it revisits an earlier direction, and a river is not lesser because it follows a channel. The distinction lies in function, not rank. Cyclical beings deepen creation by returning with greater awareness to what was once encountered unconsciously. Infinity-Origin beings deepen creation by refusing to assume that the known field is the only field available. Their first vector is therefore not rebellion, but irreversibility. Once they have genuinely expanded into a larger state, they cannot fully return to the former arrangement without experiencing an internal distortion. They may imitate the old self, perform the old relationship, or resume the old rhythm, but some part of them remains aware that the container has already been exceeded. This awareness is not always dramatic. It may appear as quiet fatigue, inexplicable distance, or the sense that something once meaningful now requires self-abandonment to maintain. Many of them spend years interpreting this irreversibility as a character defect. They wonder why gratitude does not make the old life sufficient, why loyalty does not restore the former intimacy, or why achievement does not silence the next horizon. They may accuse themselves of being restless, ungrounded, impossible to satisfy, or incapable of receiving what they asked for. Yet the deeper issue is not that they cannot value what has come. It is that value and finality are not the same experience within them. To value something is to recognize its truth. To make it final is to ask that truth to stop developing. Infinity-Origin consciousness can give profound devotion to a person, path, or creation, while still sensing that devotion must remain alive enough to change form. When others equate love with sameness, this flexibility can be misread as instability. When others equate commitment with repetition, continued expansion can be treated as betrayal. The being then faces a painful choice between belonging and internal accuracy. It may preserve belonging by reducing the expression of what it has become. It may speak in language the group can tolerate, hide the scale of its questions, or pretend that a finished answer still feels alive. This adaptation often succeeds socially. It fails energetically because the Oversoul continues expanding beneath the identity that has agreed to remain familiar. The pressure created by that split is rarely experienced as a clear spiritual message. It may become irritability, numbness, procrastination, sudden withdrawal, or the repeated destruction of structures that once seemed stable. The individual may believe it has a problem with discipline, when the deeper problem is that discipline has been assigned to the preservation of an expired form. It may believe it fears commitment, when it actually fears being sealed inside a version of commitment that does not permit evolution. The symptom appears personal, but the conflict is architectural. This irreversibility also changes the meaning of memory. For many beings, memory is a route back to identity, a way of recovering what has been lost and returning to a known center. For Infinity-Origin consciousness, memory often functions as evidence of expansion rather than instruction to return. The past is not a home waiting to be re-entered. It is a visible record of containers that once served life and can no longer define it. This is why nostalgia can feel strangely heavy for them. They may cherish the people, places, and versions of self contained in a former time, yet feel no true desire to become that person again. Others may assume that healing should restore the earlier openness, innocence, or certainty. But the Infinity-Origin being does not heal by becoming what it was before the wound. It heals by becoming capable of holding what could not have existed before the wound was metabolized. The second vector appears in the way these beings encounter possibility. They do not merely ask which available path is correct. They often sense that the available paths were built from assumptions too narrow to answer the real question. This can make ordinary decision-making exhausting, because every option seems to require agreement with a frame they have already outgrown. They are not always indecisive. Sometimes they are waiting for a reality that has not yet been structured. In lived experience, this may look like creating a role no institution recognizes, combining disciplines that are expected to remain separate, or speaking from a perception that has no accepted vocabulary. Before the new form becomes visible, the person may appear unrealistic. Others see the absence of evidence and conclude that nothing is there. The Infinity-Origin being feels the pressure of something approaching existence and cannot honestly treat the lack of precedent as proof of impossibility. Its knowing often arrives before the environment has developed a place for the knowing to stand. This capacity is not comfortable. To perceive beyond the available field is to live without the reassurance that recognition provides. There may be no mentor who fully understands the direction, no community prepared to confirm the movement, and no prior example capable of proving that the path can work. The being must often act while still translating its own perception into language. It is required to trust not only an unseen destination, but a form of movement that may be creating the destination as it proceeds. Here, the greatest resistance does not always come from fear of failure. Failure still belongs to a known framework because it means an accepted goal was not reached. The deeper fear is unintelligibility, the possibility that what is moving through the being cannot be made recognizable to anyone else. A person can endure opposition more easily than permanent misrecognition. Infinity-Origin consciousness may therefore dilute its originality, not because it doubts the truth of the impulse, but because it doubts whether relationship can survive the full expression of it. This dilution creates a peculiar kind of loneliness. The being may be surrounded by people who admire its work while never encountering the source from which the work emerged. It receives praise for the portion that could be translated and silence around the portion that altered the field. Over time, it may begin presenting only what can be quickly understood. The world then rewards the reduced expression, and the reward becomes another force encouraging the Oversoul to remain beneath its actual scale. The third vector concerns consequence rather than identity or possibility. When an Infinity-Origin being enters a stable system, its presence can reveal where stability has become dependency. It does not need to attack the system for this to occur. By asking a question that cannot be answered through existing rules, it exposes the limits those rules were designed to conceal. By continuing to develop after a role has been assigned, it reveals how much of the role depended upon predictability rather than truth. This is why such beings can attract disproportionate resistance. The reaction is not always to what they have done, but to what their existence makes visible. A family may experience one member's expansion as judgment, even when no judgment has been spoken. A community may call a new perception dangerous because accepting it would require the community to revise its image of itself. The Infinity-Origin being becomes associated with disruption because its natural movement removes the illusion that any arrangement is permanent. Yet disruption is not its purpose. Expansion without care can become violence, and novelty without integration can become another form of escape. The deeper function is to increase the field's capacity without denying the lives already rooted inside it. This requires patience that the being may initially resist, because its perception often moves faster than collective adaptation. It must learn that seeing what can exist does not mean every structure can receive that vision at the same speed. Here, the three vectors begin to touch without becoming identical. Irreversibility explains why the being cannot truthfully shrink back into former identity. Possibility explains why it reaches toward forms that have no precedent. Consequence explains why this reaching changes more than the private life of the one who reaches. Together, they reveal that expansion is not simply a personal appetite. It is an oversoul function that moves through identity, creation, and the surrounding field at once. The Infinity-Origin being must therefore stop asking when it will finally arrive at the version of itself that no longer needs to expand. That question assumes expansion is a temporary condition produced by incompleteness. For this type, expansion is not proof that something is missing. It is the manner in which wholeness remains alive. The task is not to escape every container, nor to worship endless motion. It is to become precise enough to know which forms are still growing and which forms now survive only by preventing growth. The first understanding that must be disturbed is the belief that every refusal to return is evidence of Infinity-Origin design. A being can feel incapable of returning because it has expanded beyond an old form, but it can also feel incapable of returning because the old form contains an encounter it has never completed. Movement alone does not reveal which condition is present. The same restlessness may arise from genuine emergence or from an intelligence skilled at escaping whatever threatens its preferred image of itself. Infinity-Origin consciousness is not protected from self-deception simply because its natural movement extends beyond familiar cycles. This distinction becomes uncomfortable because expansion often feels more alive than return. The new horizon carries energy, possibility, and relief, while the unfinished place carries density, repetition, and emotional consequence. A being may therefore call itself ever expanding when it has merely learned to move before anything can ask it to remain accountable. It may describe every limit as an expired container and every resistance as proof that the surrounding field cannot receive its scale. The language of infinity can become the most sophisticated shelter the unexamined self has ever built. There are departures that open creation, and there are departures that prevent contact. From outside, they can look identical. A person leaves the relationship, changes the work, abandons the community, or begins another path, and the action may appear brave in either case. The difference is not found in whether movement occurred, but in what the movement allowed the being to avoid feeling. True expansion enlarges the capacity to encounter reality. False expansion enlarges only the distance from what reality has revealed. This is where irreversibility, which once appeared coherent, becomes unstable. It is true that a being cannot unknow what it has genuinely become, but it can misuse that truth by declaring itself incapable of revisiting anything associated with the former state. Revisiting is not always regression. Sometimes consciousness must return to a place without becoming the person who first entered it. The return does not restore the old container. It reveals whether the expansion was strong enough to remain present where it once needed to flee. An infinity-origin being may insist that the past is only evidence of forms already exceeded. Yet some past forms are not dead structures, but unfinished relationships carrying living consequence. A promise does not cease to matter simply because the one who made it has expanded. A wound does not become irrelevant because the being now possesses a language large enough to explain it. The future cannot absorb every obligation merely by becoming more compelling than the past. Expansion that erases consequence is not infinity. It is appetite without memory. The first vector therefore moves through discernment rather than movement. The question is no longer whether the being feels called beyond the current form, but whether its capacity has actually increased. Can it hold more truth without immediately converting truth into departure? Can it remain present when another person's experience contradicts the identity it has built around its own evolution? Can it distinguish a structure that is suppressing life from a structure that is exposing an undeveloped part of itself? This is difficult because inner resistance does not always identify external limitation. Sometimes resistance appears because the field is too small, but sometimes it appears because the field has become precise enough to reveal where the being is still small. The person may feel constricted when asked to repeat a simple practice, listen without redirecting the conversation, or complete what no longer excites them. They may interpret the loss of stimulation as evidence that the path is finished, yet the absence of novelty may be the exact condition required for hidden instability to become visible. Infinity-origin consciousness can be especially vulnerable here because it is naturally responsive to what has not yet been formed. The unborn possibility pulls with greater intensity than the maintenance of what has already entered form. This gives the being unusual creative force, but it can also weaken its relationship with continuity. It may love conception and resent stewardship. It may open door after door while leaving others to inhabit the rooms, repair the foundations, and carry the weight of what its vision initiated. The consequence is not merely practical. Every unintegrated creation becomes a fragment of the creator's field. Projects, relationships, teachings, and identities remain energetically connected to the being even after attention has moved elsewhere. The being may experience the accumulation of these fragments as pressure and misinterpret that pressure as another invitation to expand. It moves again, believing the new horizon will restore freedom, while the unheld consequences multiply behind it. The apparent infinity becomes a corridor built from unfinished beginnings. The second destabilization enters here and cannot be resolved by better discernment alone. What if expansion itself is not always benevolent? What if increasing a field's capacity can damage the lives already organized within it, even when the expansion is genuine? The earlier view allowed disruption to appear as an unavoidable reaction from structures dependent upon predictability. But some resistance does not arise because a system fears growth. Some resistance arises because growth has arrived without relationship to what it is asking others to endure. The second vector concerns scale and consent. Infinity-origin beings often perceive possibilities before the surrounding field can name them, but early perception does not grant automatic authority. To see a larger architecture is not the same as being entrusted to impose it. A vision may be accurate and still arrive through behavior that is careless, coercive, or prematurely disruptive. The future does not become ethical merely because it is larger than the present. This becomes visible in ordinary relationships long before it appears in civilizations. One person expands into a new understanding and expects everyone close to them to reorganize immediately. They change the meaning of agreements without acknowledging that others entered those agreements under different conditions. They speak of alignment while another person is still absorbing the cost of the transition. Because the movement feels inevitable inside them, they mistake inevitability for mutual readiness. The Infinity-Origin being may feel trapped by the pace of others. It can sense the next structure with such clarity that delay appears dishonest. Yet another person's slower adaptation is not necessarily unconsciousness. They may be protecting children, shared resources, fragile trust, or a body already carrying more change than it can integrate. A field is not expanded when its most sensitive members are forced to fracture in order to keep pace with the visionary. It has merely exchanged one form of limitation for another. This does not mean the being must wait for universal approval before moving. Consensus can become a mechanism by which every new reality is delayed until it no longer threatens anyone. The difficulty is that neither unilateral movement nor collective permission can serve as a complete law. The being must carry a tension that offers no simple moral innocence. It may need to move while knowing that the movement will wound, and it may need to remain while knowing that remaining will distort what it is trying to be born. Such tension cannot be resolved by declaring that everyone chose their own experience. That idea may contain metaphysical truth while functioning as emotional abandonment. To say that others attracted the disruption can become a way of refusing to witness the actual human cost of one's choices. Infinity-Origin consciousness must be able to perceive agreements at multiple levels without using the largest level to dismiss the most immediate one. Cosmic explanation does not cancel the reality of the person standing before you. The lived test of expansion is therefore not whether no one is disturbed. Genuine transformation will disturb arrangements that depend upon the being's contraction. The test is whether the being can remain in contact with the disturbance it causes without collapsing into guilt or escaping into spiritual justification. Can it hear anger without making anger proof of the other's limitation? Can it acknowledge harm without concluding that all movement was wrong? Can it continue becoming while allowing consequence to alter the manner of its becoming? The third vector enters through embodiment. Infinity-Origin beings are described as moving beyond cycles and return. Yet incarnation places every being inside rhythms it did not design. The body wakes and sleeps, inhales and exhales, hungers and releases, strains and repairs. Attention expands and contracts. Even the consciousness that carries no final cycle must express through forms that survive by returning. This creates a paradox deeper than simple limitation. The being may originate in endless generativity, but it cannot embody that generativity through endless outward motion. A heart that only expands cannot circulate blood. A breath that only enters becomes suffocation. A nervous system kept perpetually open eventually loses the ability to distinguish revelation from overload. The body teaches that infinity may require recurrence, not as imprisonment, but as the rhythm through which boundless force becomes livable. Many Infinity-Origin beings resist this instruction because repetition feels smaller than inspiration. They may experience sleep as interruption, maintenance as distraction, and ordinary routines as evidence that incarnation has slowed them down. They push through fatigue because the vision remains active even when the body has reached its boundary. They interpret depletion as sacrifice to the larger work. Eventually, the body becomes the rejected witness of an expansion the personality continues to praise. When collapse comes, it may be mistaken for obstruction. The being wonders why the path is closed, why clarity has vanished, or why the creative current no longer responds. Yet the current may not have vanished at all. It may have withdrawn from a system that repeatedly demanded revelation without integration. The body does not oppose infinity when it closes a door. Sometimes it prevents the finite vessel from being destroyed by what the mind insists it should continue carrying. This destabilizes the earlier distinction between cyclical and infinity-origin consciousness. Perhaps moving beyond cycles does not mean freedom from return. Perhaps it means that no return is identical, even when the motion appears familiar. The being sleeps again, but not as the exact consciousness that slept before. It revisits the relationship, the practice, the wound, or the question, yet the field of encounter has changed because the one returning has changed. Then the circle was never merely a circle. What appeared to be repetition may have been expansion moving through recurrence. The Infinity-Origin being may not be designed to avoid cycles, but to prevent cycles from sealing themselves into closed systems. It enters return carrying an element that return cannot fully contain. Each revisiting becomes a pressure through which the familiar is asked to reveal another dimension of itself. This recognition does not restore easy coherence. It creates a sharper uncertainty. The being can no longer assume that discomfort means the container is expired, that vision grants the right to reorganize the field, or that endless movement proves fidelity to its origin. It must examine whether it is expanding capacity or merely extending avoidance, whether it is serving emergence or demanding compliance, whether it is moving beyond recurrence or refusing the disciplines that make expansion inhabitable. None of these questions can be answered once and carried forever. The answers change as consciousness changes. A departure that was once necessary may later become a habit. A commitment that once represented contraction may become the ground through which a deeper freedom develops. A vision that once needed protection from collective doubt may eventually need correction from the very people who could not initially understand it. Infinity-Origin consciousness is not defined by always moving away from what was. It is defined by refusing to let any movement, including expansion, become unquestionable. The deeper danger is not that such a being will become trapped in a cycle. It is that it will create a cycle around the identity of being beyond cycles. It will repeatedly outgrow, depart, initiate, and rename the pattern as freedom. The scenery changes while the mechanism remains untouched. What appears to be infinite development may become the most concealed repetition in its life. To break that repetition, the being must allow infinity to alter its understanding of direction. Expansion may move outward through invention, inward through accountability, downward through embodiment, or backward through a return that is no longer regression. It may require building what has never existed, and it may require tending what already exists until hidden dimensions emerge. The horizon does not always appear in front of the traveler. Sometimes it opens inside the place the traveler believed had nothing more to reveal.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.